Marvel Snap's newest card, Anti-Venom, is already making the rounds all across social media. Much of the early opinion has been that this card is a little bit underpowered, but I am here to tell you that I think that this card is better than you think. Anti-Venom is a 4/7 with an on-reveal ability that sets the cost and power of the top card in your deck to 0. I have developed a fairly simple heuristic for if you are interested in playing this card. There are certain types of decks that it makes sense in, and this heuristic should illustrate those as best as possible. Here's the heuristic. Are you a deck that wants to play 1/5-drop on turn 5? And then, are you a deck that is functional and willing to play Luke Cage? Those are the questions that you have to answer, and I think for almost every deck that wants to do those things, this card is actually a very reasonable addition. Now, I realize that when you look at that kind of heuristic, you might come away from it thinking that's a fairly limited card. It's really going in these like very specific mid-range decks. There's a lot of sort of tentpole mid-range decks that want to play this card, and they usually tend to be built around those 5-drops, right? You could play it in a Darkhawk deck, an Annihilus deck, a Cersei deck, a Sera deck, an Ajax deck, things like that, right? Like, it's pretty straightforward, and you can understand what the thought process behind all of it is and why exactly we're trying to do it in the way that we are. This is a fairly limited card in that sense, but there are some other things you can do even in that context. For example, one of the decks on this video is going to be talking about Anti-Venom in Hela, where it's being used as a way to get a free guy and also use that free guy in order to blink into other big guys. It gives you a backup plan, but I'll also note that Hela, as weird as it may seem, does actually fit both of those heuristics. Do you want to play Luke Cage? Yes. Do you want to play a 5-drop on 5? Yes. You are a blink deck. And so that heuristic, I haven't found a deck that wants to play this card that does not check both of those boxes. What that means is that most of the time, this is a sort of mid-range slush card. It's not doing a ton of ridiculous stuff, but it is doing something very valuable, and that is expanding your range. You end up with such a wide range of outcomes when you play this card, and it's already pretty good on rate, that it just makes your deck a lot harder for your opponent to ever really play around. Playing against this card is genuinely difficult. Obviously, Mobius is excellent, right? There's no real issue with that assumption at this point. But there is something to be said for those games where you're not getting Mobius. You are just sitting there staring down infinity. It could be anything. They could play Luke Cage and Magneto, and the Magneto is free, and you could just instantly lose. The range it provides to these mid-range decks, these like, I'm going to play 1/5-drop on 5 decks, the amount of different permutations of turn 6 that this card allows them to have is massive. Luke Cage, of course, is best friend number 1. Best friend number 2 is Shadow King. You want to bring your card back to what it was originally? Just Shadow King that lane. The good news for this card is that Shadow King and Luke Cage are super meta right now. There is absolutely nothing stopping you from doing what you need to do to make this card good, and you're not really sacrificing a lot in the context of the metagame. However, downside potential, there is a very powerful card coming out of the Season Pass. It is called Surtur, and I'm not sure many of these mid-range decks can stack up to it. I do wonder if any of them can, because if they can, this card probably will be an important piece in, say, a Sera deck that is trying to Grandmaster Shang-Chi the Surtur people. That seems like a really important thing to have access to if that's what you're trying to do, right? I am higher on this card than almost everyone else that I've seen so far. I've seen a lot of fairly negative reactions, but for me, I think this card might legitimately be a little underrated. And only time will tell. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and make a video on day 1 and say, oh my god, it's busted, go buy it. But I am going to make this video, and hopefully you come away from it understanding that this card actually does seem to have a place, and we'll have to see how long that takes before people figure out if it's good or not, if it has like a super giant type curve where it comes out, no one gets it, and then it ends up being good later, or if it has a curve more like Ajax where it is good, but people don't realize it's good for like 3 weeks, or if maybe it ends up just really blowing the doors off. I think of those, I think the Ajax or Supergiant curve is the more likely for this one. I'm not saying it'll be as good as Ajax or necessarily even Supergiant, but this card is genuinely strong, and I am a little perturbed that so many people seem to be so down on it. Let's start off with this list, which was my most successful list with the new card in it. This was a list that I took to about a 65% win rate over about 30 games. It was a very solid performer, and I really enjoyed what it was doing. I think it was very cleverly built by Zombiez Go Nom Nom in order to be good into what is a day one meta, but maybe also have some staying power. The cards I want to point out here are several packages. Package number one, we have a very minimalistic Luke Cage here. Luke Cage is here basically just for Anti-Venom. We're not really doing a lot of other stuff with him. He's just here for that. Secondarily, we also have a Mobius for our opponent's Anti-Venom. I realize this makes me a bit of a pariah, but there is something to be said for, on day one, having the answers to what your opponent is trying to do. When you're playing an Anti-Venom mirror, the person who Mobius is usually going to feel a lot better about it than the person who doesn't. In addition, because of that, there's also a Lady Deathstrike. Lady Deathstrike can answer both your opponent's Mobiuses and your opponent's Luke Cages. Those are really important to answer, honestly. And Lady Deathstrike was a big part of why this deck succeeded for me. She wasn't just blowing up Mobius and Luke Cage, she was blowing up Madam Web lanes with daggers in them. Like, this is a very powerful card in the current context of the metagame. It does a lot of dangerous stuff. Blow up an Iron Man some of the time. Really good, really strong stuff to bring to bear. And I do think there's a lot to be said for this kind of package right now. It's not like it's exactly the same as Pixie into Mobius, but having Luke Cage into Anti-Venom, if you hit something good off it, can actually be better a lot of the time. The other thing that Anti-Venom does for a deck like this is increase the range of what is possible. And I realize there are definitely some bad hits in here. I've certainly lost the 40%er when I was aiming for one of my big guys playing turn 4 Anti-Venom. There were 5 cards in the deck and I just hit one of the cards that wasn't one of the big guys. That happens. And sometimes you are just playing a Pixie and that sucks and it's awful. But generally speaking, what this deck is trying to do is play a fair adjacent type of mid-range game plan. By what I mean by that is, yes, we are going play a card on 3, play a card on 4, play a card on 5, but on 6, hopefully we're just cheating. Whether that be via Pixie Mobius or via Anti-Venom and Luke Cage, hopefully we're just doing something that is fundamentally unfair, that is cheating a massive amount of energy, and that is what makes up for our otherwise fairly mopey mid-rangey game plan. Next up is a list cooked up by a high elo player named Sandrokan. I really enjoyed playing this list, and frankly, of all of the lists that I played today, it's the one that feels like it has the most untapped potential. And I say that because, Luke Cage is kind of everywhere right now. The obvious card to pair with Anti-Venom is Luke Cage, and so everyone who's trying out the new card is also playing Luke Cage. As you can see, a deck like this has a lot of problems with it. To the extent that I would consider dropping Cosmo and just playing Rogue because of how dangerous Luke Cage can be to what you're trying to do. I've also given some thought to maybe just trying to get a Lady Deathstrike in here, same exact reason. You just really hate seeing Luke Cage and you can't afford it actually existing. That said, the smarter players will be playing Luke Cages on the final turn of the game. This deck is getting some value right now because people don't know exactly what it is. But once people start to realize that if you just start Luke Caging on the final turn of the game, you're probably going to win, that becomes problematic very fast. And so I do think that this deck has a massive amount of untapped potential. The power output felt awesome. It matches the heuristics we want. We're playing Shadow King and Luke Cage alongside Anti-Venom. We want to be playing this one card on turn 5, whether that be Ajax or Sera. It hits all the boxes that we're talking about, but right now the metagame is so hostile to it. That said, I still climbed with the deck, right? I can't just sit here and be like, oh, okay, it's bad. It's not bad. It's just, even in a metagame that's hostile to it, I was still able to climb. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. That's why I feel like this deck has some real legitimate potential moving forward. Obviously, it's not always going to be a metagame that favors you, and sometimes you just need to push through that. And this deck was able to do that in a way that I honestly found fairly unexpected. I do think that going forward, I would swap the Cosmo out for the Rogue, but as is, I'm going to present the version that he played. I believe he got to rank 25, 23 in the world, I want to say, with it. And so let's just give our due deference to that. I don't want to start messing with it immediately. That is what I want to do to the deck, but I also don't want to ruin giving deck credit by making my own changes to it. As far as how this deck plays out, it's a Sera deck, right? It does Sera stuff. In terms of cards that I'm not 100% sure about other than Cosmo, Valentina can almost certainly be Kate Bishop. I don't really get a ton out of her. Sometimes she's awesome for like that 4-cost Magneto, but it's pretty rare. You could also look into getting rid of Zabu, who I feel like was mostly just not pulling his weight here. A lot of the time, you're not really accelerating those 4s the way you want to, and most of those 4s, like the only one you're really happy accelerating are the two really big ones. You have Man Thing and you have Typhoid Mary, but a lot of the time you're comfortable just playing those as 4s. Zabu didn't feel like he was pulling his weight. It's possible there's room for another more impactful card, maybe a 2-drop to go alongside our Sera game plan that allows it to make more sense. Maybe a Killmonger, although that pushes against our Hazmat game plan. Not particularly sure, but I think there's room to play around in this shell. This is Hela, and I'm crediting it to Husky, but actually the first person I saw who sent me this was Cocobird. I'm not sure which of the two actually put the deck together. I don't know if it was Husky or if it was Coco, and by the time of recording, I'm pretty sure they're both asleep, so I'm not sure I'm able to ask, but I will try to find out and get it in the comments as fast as I can. We're calling it Husky Hela just because I assumed it was Husky because it's a Hela deck, but I did check my conversations, and the first person who sent me this was Cocobird. That said, this deck is leveraging Anti-Venom in order to try to cheat a little bit harder. I can't tell you exactly how I feel about this deck. I feel like it'll balance out at not being a very good deck. But right now on day one, it is an excellent Anti-Venom deck into the other Anti-Venom decks. And I say this because it is simply able to outpower most of them, and it runs its own loot cage. That is a very powerful position to start from. It's probably the kind of thing, my instinct is that this list will not necessarily survive contact with the wider non-day one metagame. I cannot be sure, but that is where my head is at right now. It is possible that it does, though. So if in that world, let's talk about what it is that this list is actually doing. First things first, you can use the Grandmaster to multiply your discards, or you can use the Grandmaster to multiply your Jubilees, or you can use the Grandmaster to multiply your Anti-Venoms. All of these are reasonable targets here. The other thing this deck does really well is just rip through the deck. You can use the Grandmaster to really get things moving, right? Because you have this ability to either make the next card in your deck free, draw the next card in your deck and put it on the board with Jubilee. This is the deck that is leveraging a lot of different ways to rip through the deck and execute the combo. Blink especially is kind of interesting because Blink will look at the actual cost of the card, meaning that, you know, whatever you get, you can blink it on turn 5. You can play Agent Venom or Anti-Venom. I'm going to mess that up a million times. I probably already have. You can play Anti-Venom into card plus Blink, or you can go to Blink the Anti-Venom as well. What I like about this deck is that it demonstrates a little bit of range in terms of what this card is capable of. A lot of people, including me, thought that this card was mostly typecast into those mid-range decks, into those decks that, like the ones we've shown, are straightforwardly hitting the do you want to play Loot Cage and do you want to play a 5-drop type thing, right? This does hit those, but it is very different in how it wants to do that and what its game plan is. And I appreciate that there has been room for this card in that space, because otherwise it is so typecast as a mid-range card, and it's really just like, what flavor are you playing? Are you playing Darkhawk as your 5-drop, Sera as your 5-drop, Annihilus and Cersei, all that stuff, right? And I think this represents some untapped potential. I'm not saying this is like a perfectly put together list that's going to run over everything. It is quite good, and it is very good, especially on day one here, because people don't know what the hell you're doing, and you can run them over because you're a deck that has a bunch of points and plays Loot Cage, which is really good into everyone playing all the, like, everyone who's leaning into Loot Cage in their Anti-Venom deck by playing a bunch of Afflict stuff really loses to stuff like this, right? That said, what I mostly like about this deck is just how much it shows that there's other stuff to do with this card. whether that be Blink or Grandmaster. I like that it takes the card and pushes it a different direction. And now back to your regularly scheduled mid-range piles. This card is absolutely a mid-range pile card. And there is no doubt in my mind that this is the mid-rangiest of mid-range piles. I'm not 100% sure who cooked it up. I got it from Stefan, who is the usual guy I get, mid-range piles from. It's just his. You normally have Supergiant in them. And it is leveraging a lot of the same things you'll see these other mid-range pile decks leverage, right? What it's trying to do, very specifically, is leverage the power of Luke Cage and the Afflict package in an ongoing shell. I will say, and I realize this is kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but I do believe it to be true. This is as good as I think an ongoing deck has ever been. And a lot of that is, it's not just an ongoing deck, right? Like, you are also doing this War Machine Infinite stuff. You can do really powerful stuff. War Machine lets you skip out of Jean Grey. Like, there's cool stuff happening here. A lot of cool stuff happening here. It is the strongest ongoing deck I've seen or played, straight up, in a very long time. What I wonder about is how functional it is longer term. Because a lot of the games with this deck seem to be very much scraping it out. Once people have a read on what you're trying to do, I'm not sure this deck is going to be able to succeed in a way that it is one of the better shells for the Luke Cage Afflict stuff, right? The easiest way to make an Anti-Venom deck right now is take Anti-Venom, Luke Cage, and the Afflict cards and put them into whatever you want. And this deck is doing that. But I'm not necessarily convinced it's doing that better than either of the first two decks. And that's the kind of thing that happens on day one of the metagame that doesn't necessarily last. We gradually figure out what is and is not the most efficient ways to use these packages, right? And my gut says that the other ways of using these packages are a little more efficient. That said, if you like playing ongoing decks, I really cannot stress enough that I do not think they have been better than this in a very long time. This is a meaningful buff to the Spectrum archetype. It is a great card in that context. And I will also say that you feel very reliant on Luke Cage. When you're doing the rest of what this deck does and not Luke Cage, you can be in a lot of trouble. Like, yes, you have a lot of good hits. There are some okay hits, but Luke Cage is what takes it over the top. Luke Cage is what makes this deck actually have explosive power. And if you're not getting Luke Cage and you are getting the other stuff, I do feel like there's some reasonable worries. Because you're not getting Luke Cage, your US Agent might be hitting you, your Man-Thing might be hitting you, your Anti-Venom might be hitting you. Luke Cage is the glue here, and you will notice a marked difference between the Luke Cage games of this deck and the non-Luke Cage games of this deck. Speaking of mid-range piles, this one was cooked up by Derek, and yes, it is using the other 5-drops. Like, we've gone through every 5-drop except Darkhawk and Devil Dinosaur at this point, right? Like, we've gone through every reasonably metagame playable 5-drop. Here's Annihilus and Cersei. We've gone through Sera. We've gone through Ajax. We've gone through Claw. We've gone through them all. Now we're at the other 5-drops. And I think you can really start to understand why I feel like this card is so monstrously pigeonholed as like this kind of thing. And it is genuinely good in this context, right? Because you have Cersei, which is another way of converting the 0 power into a major upside. Obviously, you evolve it. It's free. That's excellent. You have a bunch of legitimate strength that this deck can bring to bear. Typhoid Mary, you can use to like send stuff over some of the time. Not always going to be relevant, but like, let's say you got a rock on the board. That's now being sent over with Annihilus with her minus. Then you can get rid of the minus with the Luke Cage. There's cool stuff that this deck can do. But fundamentally, like, this is the kind of card that Anti-Venom is. It is a card for these play 1 card a turn mid-range decks where it's just like, it's turn 2, here's my 2-drop. It's turn 3, here's my 3-drop. It's turn 4, here's my 4-drop. It's turn 5, here's my 5-drop. And what it gives to those decks is a turn 6 that can involve anything. It's turn 6, here's my free Cersei. Like, there's so much variance that it adds, and it's almost always positive because you have a Luke Cage, right? So it's a 4/7 that you're very happy curving out, and if you hit anything good with it, you end up in a really positive spot. All these decks are not, they're not the same thing. I want to be clear about that, but they're built using the same principles. Have Luke Cage, have some big guys you're happy hitting, have Shadow King, go to town. You can do anything with these mid-range shells when you have access to this card. And that's really why I feel like this card is underrated. I feel like people are not really grasping that if you're a fan of one of those like mopey 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever happens on 6 happens on 6, this is a great card for those archetypes. And they have been pretty much ass until now. And I'm not saying that that's a permanent state of affairs, right? They might go back to being ass as soon as people start playing Agent Venom more again. I don't know. But I am a little more hopeful than I was for these archetypes existing because I've been playing these and not getting destroyed. And that's kind of interesting to me because I would expect that basically most of these archetypes pretty mediocre coming into today. Now they suddenly have some real explosive power. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I worry it was a little bit muddled. We actually stopped in the middle of it to go play one of these decks just to get a little bit more reps in terms of like how I felt about the specifics of it. I really am kind of high on this card. And a lot of it is playstyle. I like those mopey play a card on 2 drop, 3 drop, 4 drop, 5 drop. I like those decks. I do. And so this is a card that I kind of foresee myself using a decent amount. And I think it is notable that what it wants you to do is lean into being a loot cage deck, but because it is a new card, it sort of punishes people who are leaning into it being a loot cage deck, which means the loot cage decks kind of have untapped potential because there are so many other loot cages running around right now. I think there might be legitimately something here. I'm not saying that you should go out and buy it now, but I am saying that a lot of people I've seen have been treating this card like an afterthought, like it's bad, like it does nothing. And I gotta tell you, I had more success with it in shells that were worse before it to say that. Like, these are decks that just simply were not able to keep up with the point output in the game before this card came out. And now, sometimes they're getting free 12-point Magnetos. I'm not saying it's amazing, but what I am saying, like, if you were a Wiccan fan and you liked playing decks like that, this guy is that, but honestly, maybe a little bit better. And I think that that is the real thing that's sticking out to me. Is like, if you liked playing Wiccan decks, this guy is that, but also requires way less of you and lets you run more beef in your deck. And I think that's a really interesting card to me. This card is better than you think. That's where I'm at on it right now. I would not necessarily look to buy it, but this is definitely a card you're going to want to actually actively track how well decks are doing in top 10% on Untapped and things like that. Keep asking questions about whether or not you think it's worth purchasing because a lot of people seem pretty down on it. I think this card has legitimate potential and like might actually already be quite good. I don't expect the stats to bear that out for a while. I kind of expect it to be, you know, like we talked about, like Supergiant or Ajax, where the numbers on it aren't very good, but then it's everywhere at high infinite. That's a very plausible outcome for this card. I am hopeful for this card. I didn't expect it to be nearly as good as it was. That's where we're at. As always, I've been KM Best. Remember to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.